Hi there, and welcome to the Play Therapy Circle. Before we begin, please note this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It does not provide therapeutic advice, and listening does not create a client-therapist relationship. All views expressed are my own, and any case examples shared have been de-identified to protect privacy. If you're seeking personal support, please reach out to a qualified mental health professional in your area. Hi, and welcome to an episode of the Play Therapy Circle. I'm Kylie Ellison, a therapist, clinical supervisor, and play therapy trainer, and I'm so grateful you're here. This podcast is a space for thoughtful, soulful conversations about child-centered therapy, play-based work, and what it means to show up with presence and compassion, both for our clients and for ourselves. Whether you're a seasoned play therapist, a student just starting out, or someone deeply passionate about working with children, you belong here. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Play Therapy Circle podcast. I'm your host, Kylie Ellison, and I am so glad you are here. Welcome everyone to episode 12. Yep, we are definitely in the double digits now. This is good fun. I hope you guys are enjoying the podcast episodes and getting lots of useful information out of it. That's certainly our intention. I hope you guys have all had a great week. It is Thursday here. I'm recording on a Thursday, and we are in the end part of school holidays. Kids are going to go back to school next week. So that's very exciting as well for all those mamas out there listening, or dads, or carers. You get it. We're going to be glad they're back at school next week. But how fast is this year going? Like literally, guys. I cannot believe it's now October. So for any of you guys putting up your Christmas trees, I see you. I'm all for it. I see you. All right, let's get straight into the podcast episode today, because this is another really important one for our practice. And so I really want to make sure that we cover the information for you. This is especially useful or aimed at beginning play therapists who are starting their training journey or have begun in private practice or clinical work, wherever this podcast finds you, to break down and better understand what limit setting is in child-centered play therapy. I'm really mindful that this is a very important topic, so I want to do it justice, so hopefully I do. But I also want to recognize that when we're talking about the skills of CCPT, this is definitely one that is a little bit harder than the ones we've talked about previously. So far in the podcast, we've covered tracking and reflecting feelings. We're now going to kind of that next level of skill development, which is limit setting. When I started my training 10 years ago, 10 years ago, it'll be 11 years in February. When I did my training, it goes down in my memory as one of those experiences in my first workshop in child-centered play therapy where I really struggled with limit setting. And at the time, the feedback I received was that it was potentially something that on a deeper level I may struggle with, and it's important, for me to look after that and take care of that. What I want to say is that for this method that we're going to talk about today, this is the ACT method, known very well by Gary Landreth in that space of child-centered play therapy. My journey, and I want to normalize for any of you listening who are struggling with doing limit setting, that's okay. I think that continuing to work on your practice, continuing to gain that experience and knowledge, ongoing training, all of those good things help, and clinical supervision help to build your practice skills. For me, it wasn't so much about being able to put limits in place, and I think that it's important that we seek that feedback and understand more deeply our practice and our work. But for me, It was purely that I was really stuck on how many words I had to say. So I found when I was doing the ACT model that it was a lot of words that needed to come out quickly, because oftentimes kids are moving between resources and play sequences, and so you don't have a lot of time. And for me, it was around really just memorizing and remembering those words to say that I was getting the most stuck on. So if that's been an experience for you, again, I just want to normalize it, because almost 11 years of practice down the line, I promise it does get easier. What has evolved, I guess, in my practice framework, where I didn't necessarily see the full value in the beginning years of my practice, is that I definitely see there's so many benefits in doing it early on. And we're going to talk about that in terms of the delivery of this method and how we do it in a sec. But I think that what I want to plant the seed for those of you listening is that obviously it's an important part of CCPT practice, and it's something that we learn in our training experiences. But I think it's also when we start working in this space, or maybe you're doing placement, that you actually see that application of theory and concepts into real time. And it's not until you get some of that experience that I realized that limit setting has so many functions, right? And I think one of them is really around helping emotional regulation and co-regulation. And obviously that makes sense, but it was something that I needed to kind of see over my career so far in my experience, to realize that it's actually more than just putting limits in a playroom. There is so many elements to this that makes it such an important tool for our practice. So I want to talk a little bit about why it matters. I want to talk a little bit about the actual method, and we're going to talk about some of those pitfalls to get you thinking about that in your practice moving forward. So, why do we put limits in place? For those of you who are currently studying CCPT practice or have done it recently, you will probably be able to tell quite quickly to anyone that asks why we do it. There's lots of reasons, and certainly for those of you who are interested in more information in that space, I definitely recommend textbooks like The Art of the Relationship by Gary Landreth. That's a great one that gives you a good overview of what the ACT model is and how to do it. Certainly in that text, it talks about so many elements of benefit of putting limits in place, including protecting ourselves as a therapist and our physical well-being, protecting the safety and well-being of the child as well, because that's our responsibility, that's our ethical practice and professional guidelines to protect the safety of the child too. The other big one is making sure that we're protecting the resources and preventing, where we can, them being damaged or broken. There's certainly other considerations, and so some of those definitely relate to consistency of limits. So we are making sure that we're putting limits in place consistently every session. It's not that we're picking and choosing when we put those limits in place or for what reason. So definitely making sure that you're keeping it consistent across sessions, and making sure that we are protecting our professional and ethical guidelines, and that we're facilitating a socially acceptable relationship, because that's incredibly important, and we've talked about that in previous episodes as well. So definitely modeling boundaries, making sure that we are providing safety in the space, and making sure that we are providing a structure to the session, in that we want the child to be able to express themselves freely, to talk about the things that they need to talk about through play, but we want them to be safe, and we want them to know that there are important boundaries that we will hold if we need in the playroom. It's definitely important that we are offering that space, as I've just touched on, in permissiveness. We talked about that in one of our earlier episodes. But I think there's that balance between permissiveness and holding that safe space. So I plant that seed for you to consider that both can coexist. We can certainly offer that space for kids to be able to express themselves, but we want them to be able to do it in a way that is going to be safe for them and safe for us. So it's definitely important when we are doing limits in child-centered play therapy that we are doing it without necessarily any kind of guilt or shame. That's really important when we're communicating this. So we're always leaning into our tenets of CCPT, of that congruence, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. And that happens in the same way when we're setting those limits. So it absolutely happens in our tone of voice, in our delivery of the limit, in our nonverbal communication, including our body language, and then also the words that we're using. So I encourage you guys to be mindful of all of that when you are communicating this particular limit. So when we're talking about the ACT model, what are we specifically discussing? So the ACT model, simply put, provides limits using the ACT method. So A stands for acknowledging the feelings or the need, C is communicating the limit, and then T is targeting the acceptable alternative. It certainly, in terms of its benefits, offers us the opportunity to put those therapeutic limits in place whilst also communicating that empathy and being able to stay in our core tenets, which is important. Additionally, I think one of the key benefits that has become really apparent for me in the last couple of years in my practice, which is why I am more and more passionate about limit setting in play therapy, is because when we provide that alternative, when we're targeting the alternative in that T definition, we're actually offering an opportunity for kids to be able to make an alternative choice and do so to empower some of those human capacities that we talk about in goal setting. So we really are helping to build self-direction, self-responsibility, self-control, all of those good and important human capacities that often are part of our goal and treatment goals for kids that we're working with. So it has that added benefit. Like I said, there's so many different layers to it, and I think that it's truly an empowering approach where we can actually put the child continuously in the lead by offering those boundaries. So what are we talking about here when we're starting off, if we break it down, with the first letter being A for acknowledging the feelings? For those of you, again, who have already done CCPT training or in the midst of it, you would know reflecting feelings, and we covered it last week in our episode as well. But really starting off again for those beginning play therapists, a good way to deliver this first line of the ACT model is to start with you or you are. So you're feeling really angry right now. You're so angry and you really want to hit that. So we are definitely reflecting those feelings, as well as at times that need behind it as well. So you are so angry and you really want to shoot me. That's acknowledging the feelings. We do that definitely with that intention of empathy. It also, by proxy, also helps with some of that de-escalation in the moment. If the child feels heard and validated and experiences that empathetic understanding from us, our goal is certainly to help them to regulate and co-regulate with us and to be able to become more present in the room. So we are validating those feelings, reducing that shame, and inviting that regulation, as I said. C, so when we're going through the ACT model, we've done acknowledging the feelings. Now communicate the limit. So we then let the child know what they can't do in that space. I often lean into the Cochrane and Cochrane method, Nancy and Jeff Cochrane, who have a textbook, Child-Centered Play Therapy. And in that text, they talk about communicating the limit as starting with in here. Sometimes that's helpful. The ACT model itself doesn't necessarily require that first prefacing words, but it might be something that might be helpful for you. So I share all of the information for you to consider. So something I do is, in reflecting those feelings first, you're feeling really angry right now and you'd like to shoot me. In here, I'm not for shooting. So we really let the child know that this is the boundaries of the space and this is the expectations of that behavior. So we really want them to know what that limit is in the playroom of what they can and can't do. And then we're essentially providing them with an alternative or redirecting. You can shoot the punching bag instead. You can shoot the tent instead. Whatever you decide is that alternative option that helps that child to continue to be able to express those emotions that they are sharing with us, but in a more socially acceptable way, which is that barometer for our limit testing. So that is the ACT model in its totality in terms of the breakdown of that language. I think one of the things that I, again, like I said earlier, really struggled with is at times that we have children that will be very busy, that will have very heightened emotions, who will be very fast in some of their play and their therapy work. So I think it's also important to understand realistically, what does those limits look like in real time in the playroom. So I think there will probably for you be times, for those of you listening, who may only get to communicating the limit because the child is running and going so fast that you're trying to do limits every few seconds, right? And that's obviously an example. It's not what will always happen in the playroom, but I want to give you that full picture for those especially starting out in the field. So it may be that you need to do that, communicating the limit, before then being able to go back to reflecting feelings and maybe targeting the alternative. But ultimately what we aim to do is that step-by-step process of reflecting those feelings, communicating that limit, and targeting the alternative or offering that redirection. And the goal of it really is that over time, we hope that the child will begin to build those alternative ways to express themselves that are safer for them and for us. And so in effect, we're building some of those skills and capacity to be able to express their emotions, to emotionally regulate, to be able to engage appropriately with another. There is so many benefits, right? So these are all of the reasons why. And I think even for, say, therapists who have been working in the field, I want to say maybe a couple of years, maybe longer. I think if you've been out of that initial training that you've done to become a play therapist, I think sometimes those limits can become a little bit lax. So if I'm talking to you, hi, anyone listening who is 2, 3, 4 years plus, who maybe isn't necessarily following that model anymore, in the sense that they maybe have adapted it in some way to suit their practice, what I would suggest is it's always good to do a little refresher. So I'm really glad that you're listening to this podcast today, because I think it's a good reminder to be able to stay true to the approach and true to our protocol, what child-centered play therapy is all about. And so making sure that you're putting those limits in place, regardless of how long you've been working with the child. When I'm talking about, more seasoned play therapists who might be a little bit more relaxed in their approach, I think we can also get that way with children we've been working with for a long time, where our bandwidth, I guess, for their testing of limits might be a bit longer because we know them well. I think that I want to certainly express in this podcast today the importance of us reflecting on our practice and where some of these limits maybe need to occur more or potentially earlier. Because I think the other pitfall we can come into, and we're going to talk about lots of pitfalls in a second, but I think one of those pitfalls can often be around letting the play out, no pun intended, and missing the opportunity early on to put those limits in place. And I know that for beginning play therapists, sometimes it can be around the fact that they don't want to interrupt the play. They want the child to feel like they can fully express themselves, feel like they can certainly be able to tell their story in their way, and miss that opportunity to put those limits in. So for those of you listening who are beginning play therapists, I definitely have that strong message of, if it impacts your ability to stay congruent, if we go back to our very much important core tenets of CCPT of empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard, if you are no longer present in the room, if you're no longer able to be congruent, if you're no longer able to hold a space of empathy and unconditional positive regard, it's time to put a limit in. I hope that makes sense, because I think that so much of the work and what we've talked about in previous episodes is that empathetic understanding. Carl Rogers believes and spoke in his theory about, if nothing else to affect change, there needs to be that environment or functionality of that empathetic understanding in that relationship with the child. And if we don't have that, we are not necessarily promoting enough of a space where we're able to really connect with the child and help them with their therapeutic goals. That's not to say that we can't do it. It's just when we are really connecting with our CCPT framework and protocol, it's important that we lean into these important skills, including limit setting. We talked about last week reflecting feelings as being another incredibly important and pivotal part of child-centered play therapy. So we have different elements, of course, but today's episode is so much about limit setting. So I want to encourage you guys to do your own self-reflections after listening to this episode of those clients where maybe their behavior is quite challenging in the playroom or their play sequences are quite challenging, and really taking notice of when you start to feel like your congruence is impacted, and maybe reflecting on or making a plan around that language with the ACT model of how you might be able to put that limit in next time. I'm always saying that every session is about information gathering. And so again, for those beginning play therapists who maybe have started work with clients and feel like you've missed the mark, you missed some important limits, and you're really kind of beating yourself up about it and feeling really bad about it, it's really important that you don't do that, obviously, and more so take the opportunity for growth and learning. If we have had a session that has been particularly challenging for us as a play therapist in putting those limits in place, we always have the opportunity to have another go in the next session when we see the client a week later or whenever it is that they're scheduled. So we take that opportunity to do a little bit of preparation work to have an idea of, okay, if Johnny comes in and starts trying to shoot me with a Nerf gun, I know what language I'm going to use to put that limit in straight away. So being prepared in a lot of ways helps to alleviate that anxiety, especially for beginning play therapists. So definitely doing some preparation work and having some ideas in your head of that language you're going to use so that you feel more confident in that next session is so important. So what are the benefits of the ACT model? Because I've talked a lot about them, but let's do a little bit of a summary here. So it definitely, even though it seems counterintuitive when we're talking about putting limits in place with children in the playroom, it actually helps to build trust. I think that this is an important thing to remember because I know in working with families over the last few years, it's definitely important that we are helping to upskill and support parents and carers alongside the children that we're working with. And I think that certainly in modern parenting practices, certainly I can talk to here in Australia, there is certainly a movement towards parents really jumping in and helping their kids and being really sort of involved and not necessarily giving children a space to struggle or sit in the uncomfortable or navigate things for themselves. And I think unfortunately with that, it then builds this mistrust in adults in not being able to constantly or consistently hold those boundaries. So we actually help to offer a really unique space in the playroom where we acknowledge their autonomy and their right to self-expression and their right to lead the agenda of the play, but we hold that emotional boundaries and that emotional space for kids. And so by doing that, in providing some of those limits when we need to, it actually builds trust. They feel heard and respected. So I plant that seed again for anyone who's wondering about what are some of those key benefits. That's definitely one of them. It also, in building on what I just said, helps model those respectful communication and boundary approaches. So we're actually helping to role model what a socially acceptable relationship looks like, which is so important. We want kids to be therapeutically safe in the playroom. It's not a free-for-all. We're not letting kids just climb over the furniture and do whatever they need to do because we want them to be able to express themselves. Mustakis spoke about many years ago now that therapy cannot occur without limits, and I agree. I think we need those limits to help develop those skills for children. And it also certainly empowers kids with an alternative option instead of using punishment. So we really do move away from that idea of consequences and outcomes for kids and more about facilitating that internal source of evaluation, that internal capacity to navigate and manage conflict and difficult situations that come up. So we're actually helping them to build those skills by sitting in that uncomfortable and getting them to obviously redirect and use that alternative response in order to develop those new skills for expressing themselves. So lots and lots of benefits for sure. What I want to talk about before we finish up today is the pitfalls, right? So there's definitely pitfalls that we fall into as beginning play therapists or maybe seasoned play therapists as well. So I'm talking to both cohorts with these reflections. I think definitely in the first instance, and this was where I really got stuck, was wanting to make sure that I got the language right, but also there can be that element of over-explaining. So it can really feel like we need to scaffold and help the child understand while we're putting the limit in and make sure that it's being communicated in a respectful way, but wanting to give all of that detail so they understand why we're putting the limit in. At the end of the day, kids will tune that out if it's too long and they will carry on regardless. So we want to capture their attention and we want to make sure that they understand the limit in short responses to the child. So keep it short is my message. We don't need to go into a huge amount of detail. It's really about reflecting those feelings to the child, acknowledging that we understand, but communicating clearly in a short sentence what that limit is, and then offering them that alternative so they can express themselves. Definitely one of the other pitfalls I did mention a little bit earlier when it comes to rapid play, where we don't necessarily get to do a beautiful kind of sequence of the ACT model in its totality. We can, though, also fall into that pitfall of missing reflecting feelings. So we may just do that limit or just do a redirection and completely miss that opportunity for that empathetic reflecting. So definitely where you can, and make sure as much as possible we are trying to fulfill that ACT model in the steps that are provided, but acknowledging that if we don't do that reflecting feelings, the child may feel dismissed or may not feel that validation of their feelings. So important to remember. Too many alternatives. I only usually give one, maybe two, depending on the scenario and depending on the behavior. So we don't want to overwhelm the child. This is another pitfall. So feeling really clear about what could be your alternatives for any of those really big feelings where we're worried about our safety or the child's safety or the toys, right? So having ideas around, okay, I'm going to redirect kids to say the punching bag, bop bag, Big Ted, the pillows, ball pit, or whatever you've got in your playroom, right? That you can redirect them to in a safe way. Maybe have, for those beginning play therapists, have a catalogue in your mind of a couple of those so that you feel ready to offer that if you are on the spot and things happen quickly. Another pitfall to kind of round this out that I want to mention is not being consistent in following through with that limit. And I think, again, I'm really speaking to our beginning play therapists listening, because I think it's something that we will be learning the skill of. So give yourselves that empathy as well. This is not easy and there might be times you'll miss it, but making sure we certainly try and do better the next time in terms of jumping more quickly on those limits in the next session so that we feel like we are providing that consistency. So we wouldn't let a child try to shoot us in the first session with a Nerf gun and redirect them and then not do it in the second session, and then turn around in the third session and do it. There's that real inconsistency of that, which will challenge the child in understanding what that limit is. It's an inconsistent messaging. So we need to make sure that we are clear. And again, for those beginning play therapists, it might be an idea to reflect on what are the things that would challenge your congruence. What are those things in your playroom or those behaviors that could be compromised in terms of that safety for yourself or the child or the toys? That will be limits for you, and have a practice of that before you see the child the next session so that you feel confident enough when you go into that session that you will be able to put those limits in place and keep them consistent, especially for our kids who have, say, come from a trauma background or have high anxiety. They are genuinely, I believe, often at their core seeking adults who can hold boundaries for them. And so they will be testing, are you somebody that's going to keep me safe? Are you somebody that's going to hold those boundaries for me? And if you aren't, then I'm not going to necessarily be able to regulate or be able to follow those limits. So it's really important that we are holding that safe space for kids. I want to talk a little bit before I finish up about our practices in terms of that adaptability, especially for being inclusive or having neurodiversity affirming considerations. They're also really, really important, right? So I just want to offer these for your own reflections for those of you listening. Certainly adapting some of those alternatives to sensory needs. So maybe we might redirect them to a weighted ball or to a crash pad or something that might be more reflective of that individual child's needs. Very important. Using language the child understands. So keeping it simple and short, guys, so that it is something that the child will be able to comprehend. Showing respect in terms of cultural norms around expression and authority. And again, I think we can do that in a number of ways, but certainly reflecting those feelings and reflecting that struggle for kids, if it is something that is not typically part of their cultural norm, and holding that space with empathy and unconditional positive regard. It's why it works so much, right? Because we can do it across cultures. We can do it across presentations of kids. Certainly collaborating with caregivers, and that could be parents, carers, grandparents, teachers. There's lots of different stakeholders in a child's life, right? And being able to offer these limits is one of those things that we often, certainly in our practice, we will provide some of this information early on in our intervention work with families, because we really want to work collaboratively and holistically with families and family systems, right? But we also want to empower parents and caregivers and those supporting the child to be able to use those similar strategies that we use in the playroom to enhance those therapy goals and to see progress for the child. We only get that hour once a week potentially with a child, whereas parents and caregivers are certainly there for the rest of the time. So giving them those skills and knowledge is really important as well. So look, that's just a brief overview, you guys, of the ACT model, because I'm coming up again to 30 minutes. Yeah, I just talk a lot in these podcasts. Listen, I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that it has been a good reminder for those of you, I guess, looking at enhancing your limit setting practices, or if you're beginning in the field and you just wanted to make sure that you're on the right track. I'm really grateful that you are here and that you have stuck in there for the whole episode. Thank you. Look, next week, what we're going to tackle is something really important. We're starting to move, I guess, from those skills and into a lot of the elements of CCPT that we love. So next week is going to be all about the stages of CCPT. I know that's something for beginning play therapists that we certainly tackle and get our heads around and understand in that beginning work with clients. So it's very important and very useful part of our approach. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with you guys next week. Please follow us along on the Play Therapy Circle podcast on Instagram. You can find us there, and I believe Facebook as well. And check in with us, send us a message, send us your feedback if there is a topic that you would like us to cover in the future. Please follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well, and please give us a follow there too. And we will continue to grow this podcast in the weeks and months ahead to reach more and more of you practicing in CCPT who also feel that connection to child-centered play therapy that we love so much. So thank you so much for being here. Have a wonderful weekend wherever you are listening in your part of the world, and I will catch you again soon. Bye. Thank you so much for being here for another episode of the Play Therapy Circle. If anything resonated with you today, I'd love it if you could follow the podcast, share it with a colleague, or leave a short review. It really helps others find our circle. And if you have a topic or question you'd love me to explore, I'd love to hear from you. This space is for you, and I want it to feel like a conversation. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember, you belong here.